Good morning for some of you, good afternoon, good evening for many of you. I hope you are having a good day, or beginning, the start of your day looks promising. Thank you for joining us for the second day of the OTT Conference online, the online event. We are trying out a few of the, as you know, we're trying out a few of the options that this platform provides us. Yesterday we had a panel and some networking. I hope you enjoyed. And today we are going to have a keynote speech plus a couple of parallel sessions a bit later on. Today we're lucky to have Diane Stone with us. I've get Diane to come to one of our live conferences for a while. And she was going to come to Berlin, so we were lucky to have her here and with us. We've got a little bit of a glitch with the IT, as Erika I think has already told you on the chat. The platform doesn't work well with Safari, so I'm going to be sharing Diane's PowerPoint. So I recommend that you maximize the size of the screen when you're watching Diane's presentation, because then you'll be able to see the PowerPoint a little bit more clearly. As with all our sessions, this is being recorded, and we'll be sharing it with you later when the event is over, and also the PowerPoint, if that's okay with you, Diane. So if you have questions, please ask those questions in the chat option, and we'll pass them on to Diane at the end of her presentation, almost as if we were live. Okay, so over to you, Diane. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. Let me just share the screen. Hopefully this will work.
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this online version. It's a first for me, and I would have loved to have been in Berlin. Now that I'm living in Australia, it wasn't possible. So I should just say quickly, I'm based at Central European University, which is currently in Budapest and soon moving next academic year to Vienna. And what I wanted to do today is talk about a new sort of academic concept that's been revived, and which I think has some relevance to thinking about what think tanks do. So if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So these are the three themes that I want to cover very quickly. I would say that I can't do justice to this concept of epistocracy, other than to say that it's become something of a hot topic with philosophers and political theorists. And just quickly, it means rule by knowers. Okay, and some people say rule experts. An idea, I think, connects to think tanks, and it is just starting to enter stream discussion as well. So just this past weekend, in the Guardian, on the international edition, Andrew Rawnsley was writing an article that also talked about epistocracy. So it is something that I think that we're going to hear more quickly about. But first, I just want to talk about think tank transnational networks, that is, networking between think tanks and the kinds of think tank networks that they set up, and then go on to transnational policy networks, which are a larger aggregation of which think tanks might be only one set of players, before then getting on to this idea of epistocracy. So in this first theme, I'll be drawing upon my now slightly old book, which looked at global governance and regional governance and the kinds of roles that knowledge actors play in those domains. And in this regard, network is a very important social technology, a platform to help by convening and bringing together various kinds of actors. But also the kinds of networks that think also contribute to the development of a global public sphere. And this global public sphere is also accelerated by developments in IT technology, so that we're nowadays also talking about a digital public sphere. So very quickly, some examples of think tank networks that are transnational. Many of you in this forum would be familiar with the Global Development Network. This was set up the World Bank with many other international donors to help build think tank capacity in developing countries, and also to connect those think tanks network. And it has just celebrated its 20th anniversary. So Chica, if we move to the 5th slide, this is on Think Tank 20. This is another transnational network where think tanks played a very important role in helping the Group of 20, the G20, a global economic steering committee of the world's leaders from the 20 different countries. Think Tank 20 is called an engagement group, and it undertakes research and analysis to feed into the G20 summit processes as an advisory network for that international organization. And T20 was also quite important because it helped establish the format for these engagement groups. So T20 is just one. There's also Business 20, Youth 20, Civil Society 20, but there are also power differentials between those groups in that some are more influential than others. There are many other transnational networks. The Atlas Network of Libertarian Institutes. BRICS has set up a think tank council. UNDP has launched a South-South Global Thinkers Network. There's the Euro network in Europe of foreign policy think tanks. And there are probably more regional networks than there are truly or genuinely global networks. Some of the networks that I'm most familiar with are in the Asia Pacific. ASEAN ISIS is our Institutes of Strategic and International Studies. During the 1980s and 90s, ASEAN ISIS was incredibly influential in helping build foreign security cooperation in the region by developing what were called track-to diplomacy processes. ASEAN as ISIS influence has waned. It's not the case that think tanks maintain their influence consistently over time. I've also put there another example, the Shangri-La Dialogue. This is a track one venue for discussions amongst defence officials, defence ministers and military personnel, but it's actually convened by one think tank in London, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So there are various different ways in which the networking takes place. And what do they do in networking? Now, I think it's quite well known that part of the organizational DNA of think tanks to swap ideas and policy models and various innovative forms of governance. I put up there the classic definition of policy transfer, and think tanks have been really good at promoting across borders to other nations various kinds of policy models and instruments. But this is international exchange. And moving to my second theme, on the ways think tanks have been enrolled in transnational policy making. Now, on this slide on transnational policy networks, that's just to suggest organizations go by various names, okay? I try and simplify it a little bit into 4 different types. And think tanks would fall in the 4th type of network of based on producing knowledge, science or social science, use another word. But think tanks also contribute to other kinds of policy network, such as global public policy networks. Now, these are trisectoral in the sense that they bring together interests from government and international organization on one hand, and from other kinds of states. So a famous example would be Gavi, the vaccine initiative, which is composed of the Gates Foundation, many developing country governments, as well as the big pharmaceutical. So this is what I mean by trisectoral. And they form around a common problem, a common interest. So in the case of Gavi, around ensuring that there is access to vaccines for various communities around the world. Transnational advocacy networks are quite different. They're more civil society based. They're open to participation for many interested parties. They're also advocacy oriented and operate around norms. So a good example here would be the policy network that formed around dirty diamonds or blood diamonds, in bringing that cause to public and world attention, and that subsequently led to the Kimberley process for diamond certification. Okay, transgovernmental networks are different from all the other three networks in that not anybody can join. They are composed completely of official actors. Those can be bureaucrats, judges, mayors, officials of some kind who occupy a position of authority within their home state. Okay, so they're officially and interact with their counterparts in other countries. An example here would be an organization called Tax Inspectors Across Borders, which is set up by the UNDP and OECD of just tax officials to chase money laundering and tax evasion. Okay, so there are four different very types of network species, which points to the very diverse field of global governance and the kind of challenges that are encountered in many areas of policy, a few areas which I've there. But the point I want to make here is that transnational networks or transnational policy communities emerge around these problems. And each of these problems or issue areas or policy sector operate with their own specific actors, knowledge, and expertise. The question I pose myself, and that I wrote about in the book, is policy networks like these important? I think they are because they're growing in number, because international organizations and governments patronize them and fund them, because of the extensive range of policy problems that we witness at global and regional and transnational levels. Their policy roles and scope is becoming much more extensive. They're also enjoying funding from governments and international organizations, and making a whole range of decisions regarding allocations of resources. So yes, they're becoming more important, but they're relatively little known about. So there are transparency and accountability questions which are compounded by a high level of public ignorance. So in the next slide that I'll go to in a moment, just to give a few examples of transnational policy networks, they are an elite form of governance, and ones that are also incredibly reliant upon drawing in expertise and the advice from scientists and professionals and various other knowledgeable actors. So one of the examples there I have is the Global Gas Flaring Reduction Initiative. This is not the kind of organisation that you read about in the newspapers, but it is in the area of gas flaring, and but it's highly dependent on the kind of expertise that comes from engineers. By contrast, coming back to the G20 example, their global finance experts are very important alongside banks. So the kind of expertise they find with central bankers. And again, this sort of demonstrates how policy communities emerge around specific issues of global governance. So turning to this issue or idea of epistocracy, again, the simple definition is that it's rule of the wise. So I'm suggesting that epistocratic tendencies are starting to emerge in areas of global and regional governance because it's extremely difficult to establish institutions of representation, democratic representation at the global level. Now, think tanks might play a role in promoting certain community interests or certain policy ideas, but the institutions are weakly developed for doing that. It's not as if we can see in terms of global governance a relation of the kinds of institutions that we see at the nation-state level. This is not to say that there aren't various kinds of deliberative forums, such as the G20 and its engagement groups represent, or that there aren't opportunities for NGO observers, such as within various UN agencies, but they're not as strong as the kinds of institutions of accountability that we see inside nation states. So for some, there is a concern that we might be witnessing the slow or incremental development of epistocracy in global governance. Now, the limited notion of epistocracy is the old-fashioned idea that those who are deemed to be wiser or more knowledgeable are given extra votes or a greater say in decision-making and in governance. As I say, that's the limited notion, but if you think about rule in a broader sense, it entails recognizing that sometimes expert actors might have a greater capacity for superior judgment in governance processes. Now, let me state at this point, I am not advocating epistocracy at all. I'm simply saying that this is a framework through which to potentially assess developments in global governance and whether or not think tanks might play. So there is a question whether or not epistocracy can be made more democratic. Okay, so it's not necessary to think of epistocracy at one end of the opposition to democracy. The two can be brought together potentially on the spectrum, build into transnational policy communities various forms of accountability processes to make expert actors, of which think tanks are one actor, more accountable, more representative or more transparent in the absence of global democracy. So going to the slide on transnational knowledge regimes, this is pretty much a bit of a summary argument where I'm suggesting that transnational policy communities and networks, but also international organizations and various other forms of collaboration can become nodes of epistocratic decision making. And this is happening in the absence of strong structures in global governance or transnational public spheres. Now, as I say, it's an open question whether or not these tendencies towards autocracy, if you accept my argument, whether this is a challenge to democracy or ultimately a challenge to other forms of governance like kleptocracy or aristocracy. This is an open question that is something that I hope to investigate in future. Also, there are limits to transnational epistocracy. We're all familiar with alternative and the policy debate circumstances that we've been in for the past decade or more. The communities are distrustful of experts and disenchanted with the evidence that. So that, I think, is a very strong constraint on epistocracy. Also, the nation state is not going to disappear anytime soon, and the sovereign powers that nation states exert will also act as a brake on the development of epistocratic tendencies in global governance, because all policy in some ways is local and has to be implemented within nation states and with the cooperation of local communities. But as I say, I think there are some interesting implications to investigate, and turning to epistocracy and think tanks. How could I talk today without mentioning the coronavirus? I think potentially the virus could be re-establishing that worth of experts. They are very much needed scientific collaboration, but also for collaboration between governments in coping with the virus and its aftermath. And we see this, for example, in the European Parliament. It has a website where it lists some main reports of think tanks called What Are the Think Tanks Thinking? And it has just initiated a specific website on coronavirus with regard to what the think tanks are thinking. So there are going to be, I suspect, many more opportunities for various kinds of knowledge brokers after this pandemic has hopefully died out, if there is a move towards big government. Now, big government is probably more likely with the not liberal democracies, with the advanced industrial democracies, those states that are more resilient to dealing with the pandemic. But in order to revive, there are going to be more funding streams towards science, certainly in the global health area, if not elsewhere. But having said that, I think the old questions about legitimacy and accountability of experts will exist just as much to think tanks. And I would like to end here on the last slide, that if you're actually interested in this idea of epistocracy, then you could find a little bit more in this open access book that I've recently published last year. So, and if you've got any questions about this concept, I'm more than happy to address them.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Diane. I think you can turn on your video again.
Okay. This was off. Okay.
Yeah, for some reason, I don't know. Not yet, but it might come back in. not coming back on anyway.
Okay.
Let's. I'm sorry for any. Oh, I lost you. We lost Diane. I think she'll be back soon, I hope. Sorry if there was any confusion with the slide. I was passing the slides as Diane was speaking, but I will try to make up for that with some of the questions that you're asking. I can't see you, Diane, on the backstage. I think you have to join us again on backstage as you did before. Otherwise, it's hard to. We can bring you back into the. So Diane, I think you might have to. You might have to sort of open a new tab or log in again to the backstage as you did before. Sorry about that. While we wait for Diane, maybe if you have any more questions, please do ask them on the chat option. Sonia Stojanovic-Gajic has asked a question. How strong are transnational policy communities as opinion leaders and towards which audience in comparison to rising transnational populist right-wing groups?
Hi, can you see me now?
Yes, I can see you now.
All right, I had to log back in, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. We're learning as we go.
Okay.
So as I warn people, please pardon these glitches as we get the hang of the space. So there's a question from Sonia for you, Diane.
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear. I'll read it. I'll read it for you. How strong are transnational policy communities as opinion leaders, and towards which audience in comparison to rising transnational populist right-wing groups, such as the World Congress on Families, that also produce knowledge and engage in value discussion?
Mm-hmm. So I missed the first part of the question. How
strong are transnational policy communities in comparison to these populist right-wing groups?
Okay, transnational policy communities are not necessarily pure. They come with their own biases and prejudices and consensual understandings. And I would also say that there is always a competition of ideas, a competition of knowledges. So it's not just about how strong are they in relation to another set of actors. I think the more pertinent thing to ask is, what is the basis of their authority? Okay, so going back to those 4 different types of networks, if a network it might be called a consortium or an alliance, or it goes by very many different names. If a consortium or an alliance is more civil society based, then its power is more normative. But if it's a network that can bring together the authority of various states and international organizations as participants in it, then that kind of network has a higher level of formal authority, the backing of the sovereign powers of states to further strengthen the power and influence of that particular arrangement. So transnational policy networks, with the participation of governments and international organizations, plus business and corporations, plus other kinds of stakeholders, compound or crystallize both the official or formal power, but sometimes also the expertise or professional power, or the business knowledge and expertise that might come, depending on the composition of the network. So if I think of the Garvey example together, because it was a partnership, the partnership element made it more effective, but the backing of developing country nations also gave it much greater official authority and moral authority in the kind of activity that they were involved in. So it's the composition, I think, of particular policy networks as to whether they're more civil society based and loose, as opposed to the more transgovernmental variety, which are purely government-based international networks. The authority basis differs quite substantially.
Stephen Yeo asks about how has your thinking evolved since your early work, referring to the 2005 knowledge networks and international development work with Simon Maxwell. You've been working on this field, for a while now. How has your thinking evolved since then?
Okay, I can see Stephen has mentioned epistemic communities, and I think there is a pretty clear link between epistemic communities that I was talking about back then and also epistocracy today. The distinction between epistemic communities is that they were providing inputs into decision making, okay? They were supporting official decision makers. The epistocracy concept makes a huge leap, and I think it's a huge one, by making the assumption that certain experts in certain fields have the right to government, okay? So that they have the right kind of credentials to govern, okay? So that certain kinds of health experts in a specific health field have the right to make the decisions and allocations of resources and all the other kinds of decisions there. This is not something that epistemic communities had. They needed the patronage of governments or international organizations or some other kind of official agency. Okay. So that would be the big step that I'm making, but I do want to repeat, I'm not necessarily advocating epistocracy. I'm just thinking it's a trend that maybe we should be looking at and evaluating, and whether or not think tanks are involved in this. If they are, then that raises a whole series of questions about their legitimacy as part of a network of some kind in a specific policy area.
Thank you. And this makes me think. I'm guessing think tanks are involved in some of these spaces, whether the formal or informal way. But also, they are experts. Are part of these experts who join. There's a revolving door between them and these spaces. And I wonder as well whether, of course, the experts who get to join, who get to play these governing roles, are going to be the ones from the think tanks that are better positioned to share those experts.
Yeah.
And they're going to be the ones that are better resourced, probably the ones that are placed in the kind of the global hubs of governance and and power in the world. And so, in a way, they are furthering creating divisions or inequality in the way that experts get governed. So we might be talking about experts are playing a role, but the question is who among those experts are actually getting to play the role and getting access to these spaces.
Well, in the notion of epistocracy, experts would get to choose the experts who get to play. At the moment, I would say it's governments get to choose which experts get selected into various decision-making forums, like the ICPP, for example. Their government delegates effectively to the panel. So, yes, it's important. And not all experts get to be part of epistocratic processes. And I think it's important to say again that we're not going to have fully fledged notions or institutions or practices of epistocracy. There will be this mediation between epistocracy and democracy, or with other forms of governance regimes as well, more authoritarian regimes as well, which then goes back to your question, who gets to select, who gets to choose. And I'm not saying that experts are necessarily the best decision makers. Experts also get things wrong, they're not all-seeing or all-powerful at all.
So let me go to a question by Henning first, and then we'll go back to Simon, who has asked a couple of questions, and then I think we're gonna have to finish the session. But Henning asks, how do you weigh the notion of national differences in transnational networks? Experts are hardly neutral. They might offer different views on an issue, but also lean towards the government's positions, especially if they get chosen by the government, I guess. How can you avoid to burden transnational networks with conflict and help use diversity to increase knowledge and legitimacy?
Gee, that's a big question and a difficult question. I've seen a variation of this question in relation to international organizations, in the sense that when you're appointed to an international organization, you're not meant to go there representing national interests, but to help promote the objectives and mission of the international organization. So this is going to be a perennial concern. And I don't think this is something that can be easily resolved. It's actually a long-term process of socialization, the development of professional norms, various forms of civil service training, or when I say civil service training, I mean civil service training for the network, rather than for a government department or something like that. So it's these sorts of activities take time and are not necessarily quick enough to develop for network management to resolve those kinds of questions regarding conflict or certain prejudices or biases that individuals might bring to them, or not just individuals, also organizations might bring with themselves to the network, because we all have our local identities and communities to which we belong to at a local as much as a national level. So there's no clear answer on that one, I think, but it's a long-term exercise of social learning, I think, about what a network or an international organization is trying to achieve at a regional
and finally, a couple of questions from Simon Maxwell. But let's focus on the second one. Both are practical. I think the second one is a bit more politically practical. How is the right to govern acquired? What do I have to do or be for the Prime Minister to hand over the reins?
Oh, I think Simon wants Boris to hand over the reins, perhaps. This is the big problem with epistocracy, because it's never really been operationalized in a pure form, let alone a diluted form. These kind of mechanics of epistocracy have not really been developed, and that's been the shortcoming with the political theorists and the philosophers. They've not been interested in real-world implementation issues. But what I'm suggesting is that it's not the right to govern is far less likely to happen inside the nation state than it is in transnational domains of governance, because the institutions of power and authority are so much more weakly governed. So in terms of acquiring the right to govern, this is something, it's like mission creep in a way. It is just gradually taken in because there are too few institutions or governments or political leaders or other actors having the means or capacity to slow it down or to stop it altogether.
Great. All right. So thank you very much, Diane. I mean, there are more questions coming. There's a comment by Stephen reflecting on the effect this has on politics and whether this encourages the growth of populism and the backlash against expertise. So we talked about this in terms of technocracy and governments trying to claim that they are all experts and not politicians, and what happens with that. And I feel we see cycles of this over time, where governments claim expertise to be driving them, science to be driving their decisions, and then they turn to ideology. The extremes probably are the worst, but lots of very interesting implications for think tanks, for our work, for our discussion. We have in about 20 minutes we can have 2 parallel sessions. One looking at diversity in think tanks, and I wonder if more diverse think tanks might be able to also engage in a much more effective way, or maybe hold these transnational networks to account more effectively from different points of view with different entry points, and also technology and collaboration in the time of COVID-19, and the way that technology might also allow us to connect to these transnational networks more effectively, more quickly, whether directly or indirectly as well, through through partnerships, through collaborations, through alliances with other organizations. But anyway, these keynotes are meant to give us some thinking, some ideas to think about, some food for thought for the rest of the conference, and this certainly has done that. Thank you very much, Diane, and I hope you can join us for the rest of the conference.
Well, at that, and I hope to see you in Berlin as well.
We will. We'll make a point of going. Great. So thank you very much.